Today's episode is sponsored by First Cup Coffee. Go ahead and snag your bag. Any company based enough and brave enough to sponsor this show deserves our support. Go to firstcup.com, use my promo code Liz for 10% off. All right, my friends, we have quite a show today. We are going to start with a bombshell new video of Tim Walz praising a radical Muslim cleric. Yes, you won't believe it until you see it, so I'm going to show you that video shortly. Also, David French, who has been a thought leader in the conservative movement for a long time, but has really gone off the deep end as a never-Trumper, wrote an article in the New York Times titled, "To Save Conservatism from Itself, I Am Voting for Harris." We're going to respond to that today on the show. Also, the 5 stories the mainstream media is refusing to report to you this week. We're not refusing to report them, though. Stick around to the end of the show for that. Also, the media is freaking out over the name Tampon Tim. I mean, freaking out. It's quite hilarious. I'm going to read you some juicy and humorous articles, not full articles, but pieces of the articles where they are just losing their minds. Welcome, everybody, to The Liz Wheeler Show. It's a new season of The Liz Wheeler Show. What this show won't be: boring, old, ineffectual commentary. Go tune into Fox if you want the generic political yammering that got us into this mess. Small assumptions allow big lies. So The Liz Wheeler Show will challenge everything. On this show, it's be based or our country dies. What does it mean to be based? Stay tuned. I'll tell you what it means to be based. It means basing your worldview in reality. And part of doing that is acknowledging that whether we want to be or not, we are part of spiritual warfare. In politics, I think this is especially prevalent, and therefore, we will start this episode with a prayer. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl through the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. I wish it weren't so, but we are part of spiritual warfare. It is all around us. Whether we acknowledge it or not, it is time we acknowledge it as we fight the absolute evil in our country. In all the time we've been alive, my friends, the US dollar has always been the primary currency. But that may not be the case much longer. The US dollar is facing unprecedented inflation. And our politics, I don't need to tell you this, is getting increasingly unstable. And if that wasn't scary enough, the government is looking to take total control over all of our money with a new so-called digital dollar. You remember what happened to the truckers' convoy in Canada? What Trudeau did to them? Yeah, that's what's going to happen to us too if there's a digital dollar. That's why it's never been more important to take control over your wealth. Don't let your life savings become a casualty of failing banks or currency wars. Now is the time to call the only precious metal dealer I trust, American Hartford Gold. They'll show you how to protect your savings, your retirement accounts, by diversifying your wealth portfolio with physical gold and silver. With the finest products, amazing customer service, and a buyback commitment, American Hartford Gold has a 5-star rating from thousands of reviews and an A+ from the Better Business Bureau. American Hartford Gold supports content like this that is committed to bringing you the truth. Tell them I sent you. They'll give you up to $15,000 of free silver on your first order. Call them now. You can click the link in the description on this episode, or you can call 866-996-5172. That's 866-996-5172. Or if you prefer text messaging, text my name, Liz, to 998899. Again, the phone number to call is 866-996-5172, or text Liz to 998899. All right, my friends, here's the story of the day and the base take on it. And let me preface this by saying, I think Republicans are missing using this story as a bigger attack against Kamala Harris and Tim Walz than they understand that it could be. And what I mean by that, the video that I'm about to show you is Tim Walz, Kamala Harris's vice presidential running mate, calling a radical Muslim cleric a, quote, master teacher. And I'm going to show you that video in just a second. But before you watch it, I want to preface it with this. There's this old adage in politics, in presidential campaigning, that your vice presidential running mate will neither make nor break your campaign. And there's some truth to this. There is. We've seen this happen. It was not Sarah Palin's fault that John McCain lost. People don't even remember who ran with Hillary Clinton, Tim Kaine. It was Hillary Clinton's fault that she lost. It is true to a certain extent that vice presidential running mates don't make or break. But I think, my friends, that this might be the exception. And I'm going to show you this video, and then I'm going to tell you why. Take a look.
I would like to, first of all, say thank you to Imam. I am a teacher, so when I see a master teacher, I know it. And over the time we've spent together, one of the things I've had the privilege of is seeing the things in life through the eye of a master teacher to try and get the understanding.
Okay, so the two takeaways. Tim Walz called this imam a master teacher and said that throughout his interaction with this imam, he has gained an understanding, looked at things through the perspective as taught to him by the master teacher. This is important because that's the impact that this radical cleric had on Tim Walz. So let me first tell you who this radical cleric is so you can understand exactly how significant this is. And then I want to tell you why I think that this video could be the exception to the rule that says that vice presidential running mates don't make or break an election. So the imam that Tim Walz is referencing, his name is Asad Zaman. Asad Zaman. And I'm going to read to you from this report from the Washington Examiner. Zaman, who is the director of Minnesota's Muslim American Society, asserted on October 7th of 2023, you remember the terror attacks, that, quote, he stands in solidarity with Palestinians against Israeli attacks. This after 1,200 Israelis were killed by Hamas terrorists. His organization, Zaman's organization, which has a related chapter that once came under fire following children at a 2019 event it hosted calling for murdering Jews, said on October 7th that it, quote, reaffirms its unwavering support for the Palestinian people in their struggle against the Israeli occupation. And there you have the phrase, Israeli occupation, that tells you that this is a Hamas sympathizer. Now, that's not the only evidence that this man is a radical Muslim cleric who is a terrorist sympathizer. According to the Washington Examiner, Zaman's social media history includes sharing a link to an article on a website in 2015 for a pro-Hitler film. Okay. And in 2016, he shared an official press release issued by Hamas. The press release mourned the death of an Islamist leader who was executed after being convicted of war crimes. So, this is a radical Muslim cleric that Tim Walz is praising. And this is why this video is more significant than your average Republican consultant telling Trump to be centrist and in the middle and not to offend people. This is what they're missing. Kamala Harris actually understands the liability of this video more than most Republicans do. She understands it and has proved that she understands that Tim Walz is a liability in this sense because she actually issued a statement saying that Tim Walz never had a close personal relationship with his imam. Well, yes, Kamala, he did. And the fact that you feel that you need to preemptively deny this shows us that she believes this is a liability. This is why it's a liability. Cori Bush, a member of the squad in Congress. She was buddy-buddy with AOC. She was buddy-buddy with Rashida Tlaib. She was buddy-buddy with these terror-sympathizing, openly Marxist, young members of the Democratic Party in Congress. She lost her primary race. She lost to another Democrat that no one's ever heard of, even though Cori Bush is a very prominent member of Congress. Jamal Bowman, also a member of the squad. I think the only male member of the squad, if I'm not mistaken. Very radical. He also lost his primary in the state of New York. Why did these two squad members lose their primaries when they are so prominent? I assume that they are quite successful fundraisers for the Democrat Party. Most prominent members of Congress are. Why did they lose their seats? And not even in a general election, in a close district, but to another Democrat in a primary. This is like the ultimate slap in the face to a politician, especially a powerful one. You lost in your primary. What? Well, I'll tell you why they lost. They lost because Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman were both openly anti-Semitic. Openly sympathizers of Hamas, a terror organization that committed the heinous terrorist attacks in Israel on October 7th. And you know what? The Democratic Party is different than Democratic voters. And what I mean by that is the Democratic Party leadership is very afraid of offending terror sympathizers. The Democratic leadership is very cozy with the groups marching on college campuses across the nation that are openly supporting Hamas. But that's different than the average Democratic voter in the United States of America. The average Democratic voter aren't evil. They're not even bad people. The average Democratic voter is, and I mean this without animosity, just kind of gullible. They hear what Democrat politicians say. Oh, we stand up for the working class. We stand up for teachers. We want equity. And they don't understand that that's a lie. They're kind of gullible and they fall for these things. They're just regular old people in the United States who don't do their due diligence to figure out the Democrats are lying. But Democratic voters are very different than the radical tentacles that have taken hold of the upper echelons of the Democratic Party or the indoctrination centers on college campuses. And that's why Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman lost their primaries, because Democratic voters were disgusted. They were revolted by this anti-Semitism that was being articulated by these squad members, and they voted them out. Which means that Kamala Harris is scared. Kamala Harris is very scared. She saw that video of Tim Walz too. Clearly not before it made it into, not before she chose him as vice presidential running mate, but she would never have issued a response saying he doesn't have a close personal relationship with this radical Muslim cleric if she didn't know that this would be a huge turnoff to the Democratic voting public. So maybe we are experiencing for the very first time a vice presidential running mate who actually will have an impact on the outcome of this election, because this is not an isolated incident. Tim Walz was also at an event with the founder of a group called Students for Justice in Palestine. Now, Students for Justice in Palestine is an anti-Semitic organization at its root, but Tim Walz was at a conference hosted by CAIR. CAIR is the Council on American Islamic Relations, and it is a borderline terror supporting group. And what I mean by that, I say that very judiciously, actually, because CAIR was an unindicted co-conspirator in the largest terror funding prosecution in United States history. And all that means is that CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, this group, wasn't punished for their role because they agreed to testify against people that the U.S. government said, yeah, if you testify against these people, then we won't punish you for things that we know you did. And CAIR took that offer from the U.S. government, so they weren't themselves convicted of funding terrorism, even though they played a role in it, and we all know that they did. The co-founder of the Council on American Islamic Relations, his name is Nihad Awad, said, I am in support of the Hamas movement. And several senior members of the Council on American Islamic Relations in the past have been jailed for their ties to terrorism. Tim Walz spoke at an event that was hosted by the Council on American Islamic Relations Minnesota chapter. He was with the founder of Students for Justice in Palestine. And that group is behind so many of the pro-Hamas, the anti-Semitic marches on college campuses that we see across the country. This is a huge liability. Mark my words, my friends. This is a huge liability for Kamala Harris if, and I know this is a big caveat, this is a big if Republicans are smart. If Republicans are savage with this. If Republicans are based, if Republicans make sure that every voter in the United States sees that video and hears this information, it very possibly could make a difference in the outcome of this election. You know, there's a thought leader in the conservative movement by the name of David French. I'm sure you've heard of him. You probably, if you're like me, used to read his work all the time. And the reason that I'm bringing him up today is because I find it personally almost devastating, disappointing, verging on devastating, right along that spectrum of emotion, to watch what has happened to David French today. I used to respect David French's work so much. He was one of the first conservatives, he's a lawyer, he was one of the first conservatives who would actually use the power of the law to protect the free speech rights of conservatives on college campuses. I'm talking like a decade and a half ago, back when the censorship or the cancellation of conservatives on college campuses became prominent. Those were the stories we'd hear reported, that a conservative was downgraded because of their conservative views, or they weren't allowed to table because they were pro-life unless they were in a designated free speech zone. And David French came in and he used the power of the law to defend the free speech of these people. And I had so much respect for him. And then something happened to David French. And I don't know what that thing that happened to David French is, but he turned his back on the conservative movement. He became, maybe the thing that happened was Donald Trump. But when I say the thing that happened that was Donald Trump, I don't blame Trump. I'm just saying that was the turning point in David French's career. And he is now so never Trump, so against the so-called MAGA movement, that he wrote an article in the New York Times, where he works now, entitled, "To Save Conservatism from Itself, I Am Voting for Harris." And when I first saw that, I actually thought it was a parody. I saw a screenshot of this on X 2 or 3 days ago, and I thought, surely not. Surely he would not write an article with that title. Surely this is a joke. Surely this must be the Babylon Bee, perhaps? No. This is a real article. And if it sounds like an insane headline, it's because it is. It would be like saying, to save the baby, I'm aborting her. To save the Second Amendment, I'm going to confiscate your guns. To save kids from transgender ideology, I'm going to trans that kid. To save free speech, I'm going to censor you. To save your job, I'm going to fire you. To save the American Republic form of government, of the people, by the people, for the people, I'm going to vote for a Marxist. I want to read a little bit of this because, like it or not, David French, because of his legacy in the conservative movement, has some influence left, particularly in certain circles of conservatism, and he's completely wrong. It's not just something to be mocked, although this is easy to be mocked, but it's something important to debunk. These are his reasons for voting for Kamala Harris. He says, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris in 2024, and ironically enough, I'm doing it in part to try to save conservatism. Here's what I mean, he writes. Since the day Donald Trump came down that escalator in 2015, the MAGA movement has been engaged in a long-running, slow-rolling, ideological, and characterological transformation of the Republican Party. Let's just pause there for a second. I don't know why that's an indictment against Donald Trump. The previous control of the Republican Party were libertarians and swamp creatures, the Uniparty, the George Bushes, who are just about indistinguishable from the left, people who start forever wars, who spend us into oblivion. This is not a bad thing to have a check on the Republican Party and say, well, wait a second, you are betraying the values of the Republican Party. You're turning it into something bad. It's time for a renewal. Well, apparently to David French, it is not time for a renewal. He says at each step, it has pushed Republicans further and further away from Reaganite conservatism. Pause there again. This is perhaps one of my most unpopular opinions. I think Reagan was a great president, obviously. I think what Reagan did to end the Cold War, to defeat communism, the spread of communism, is unparalleled in world history. But there were also some domestic policies of Ronald Reagan that are still wreaking absolutely dreadful havoc in our country today. For example, Reagan was the one who shielded vaccine manufacturers from liability. The vaccine manufacturers came to Ronald Reagan and they blackmailed him. They said, if you don't stop people from suing us because our vaccines are hurting them and the people are suing us after they've been harmed, we're not going to make these vaccines anymore. And so what did Ronald Reagan do? He passed a law that took liability away from vaccine manufacturers, and now the U.S. government pays out people who have been harmed from vaccines. But what's the implication of this? The implication of this is that vaccine manufacturers have absolutely zero incentive to have their products be safe. Zero incentive, because they're never held accountable. They're never responsible in any way for the damage inflicted by their own product. Ronald Reagan fell for that. And that has implications today, serious implications. He also ushered in no-fault divorce. He was the first governor in the United States to allow no-fault divorce in the state of California, probably because of his own history with divorce. And I say this not to trash Ronald Reagan, but just because people like David French don't actually analyze the Republican Party, especially historically, or Republican politicians through a fair lens. They don't objectively analyze the legacy of certain Republicans or certain brands of Republicanism. They just say, Ronald Reagan, let us hold Ronald Reagan up onto a pedestal. Well, no, you can admire what he did on communism, but you also have to acknowledge that objectively, he also caused some damage domestically, some pretty serious damage that we are still suffering the repercussions of to this day. But he wants to take us back to that, David French does. He says, the MAGA movement, or Donald Trump, has divorced Republican voters from any major consideration of character and leadership, and all the while it has labeled people who resisted that change as traitors. This is ironic to me because if you look at President Trump's life, sure, you can objectively analyze it and say, oh, wow, he's been married 3 times. That's not typically what Republican voters advocate for when it comes to family. And you can acknowledge that divorce destabilizes families. You know, broken families are the root of a lot of problems in our society. At the same time, that isn't the current Donald Trump. That's Donald Trump's past. The current Donald Trump actually has a tremendous amount of stability. He's been married to Melania for I don't know how many years, decades. His children and his children's children, his grandchildren, adore him, respect him. He's present in all of their lives. In fact, his life right now is an example of family stability. And it's funny that people like David French, who act like Donald Trump's divorces should be somehow kind of a disqualifier for office, ignore the fact that Ronald Reagan was also divorced. And not only was he divorced, he used his own personal experience in divorcing his first wife, or his first wife divorcing him, to motivate a policy that's been incredibly destructive for the United States of America. Just a note. David French goes on to say, let's take another assertion that should be relatively uncontroversial. Political violence and threats of violence have no place in American democratic process. It's actually not entirely true, right? Wasn't our country founded on political violence? I'm not advocating for political violence. In our current situation, I generally think it's wrong, but it's one of my pet peeves when people say political violence has no place in America. Like, we were founded on political violence. He goes, yet threats and intimidation follow the MAGA movement like night follows day. One of the saddest stories of our time is the way in which even local election officials and local school board members fear for their safety. The level of threat against public officials has escalated in the MAGA era. It's obviously wrong if anybody is threatening a local school board member, but let's remember what David French does not note here, that these local school board members are advocating for, grooming children into, and inflicting actual harm on children in the name of gender ideology and critical race theory. They are also rejecting the objective reality that parents have dominion over their children and not some school board member. So not justifying threats against school board members, but lacking a little context there, Mr. French. He said in the MAGA era, MAGA Republicans often wield threats as a weapon against Republican dissenters. What? That's not frequent at all. I can't even think of one example of that. And every American should remember January 6th when a mob of insurrectionists ransacked the Capitol. Oh, he buys into the left's lies about January 6th. He thinks Donald Trump is an insurrectionist because Donald Trump told people who were committing vandalism and going into going into prohibited areas that wasn't really clear that it was prohibited because you had people moving the barriers, people who were connected to feds moving the barriers. He's calling those people insurrectionists, even though Donald Trump told them to protest peacefully and powerfully, and when there was vandalism being committed, he told them to go home. If there are any Republicans who still buy into the left's narrative on January 6th, I think we can dismiss them and dismiss their opinions. And I don't say this, you could, on January 6th of 2021, before we knew the facts on the ground, before the reporting came out about the feds infiltrating and encouraging and essentially entrapping people, before any of that came out, I don't blame you for looking at the way the media was portraying January 6th and thinking, oh, that doesn't look good. Because there were people doing things that they should not have been doing. That's unequivocally true. No one, I think, argues otherwise. What we argue against is the weaponization of the federal government against people who, at most, committed vandalism, walked inside a secure fence or inside an open door that was opened by police, and then have terrorism charges added to their to the indictment against them. That's David French doesn't mention any of that. He doesn't mention the righteous indignation that Americans felt after the 2020 election was electioneered. There is simply no argument that rules around elections, laws around voting were changed by people who had no authority to make those changes. Look at Wisconsin, for example. There is no authority for these election officials to put unmanned drop boxes in cities across Wisconsin. It was against the law. But because they changed that law without authority, it allowed the left to play a different ground game to recruit voters. And the voters themselves might have not been committing open voter fraud. They didn't know they were, but the rules had been changed, which means those votes were invalid. David French doesn't mention any of this. He said, only one party has nominated a man who was indicted for his role in the criminal scheme to steal an American election. Oh, was Donald Trump the one that changed those rules? No, he was not. He was looking for a constitutional remedy against the electioneering. And he didn't find one. Because the were unwilling to listen. The media propagandized. I don't want to digress into January 6th and the 2020 election. We have plenty of time for that. But the lack of context that David French is adding to this article is at the level of, the New York Times where he works. He said, "It is fascinating to me," this is French, "that there are voices online who still claim that a person can't be Christian and vote for Democrats, when the Trump campaign watered down the Republican platform on abortion to such an extent that it's functionally pro-choice." This is actually a very interesting conversation to be had. And I know abortion is not a popular topic to talk about, but this is interesting because Donald Trump was the most pro-life president of our lifetime, hands down. Donald Trump appointed the Supreme Court justices that overturned Roe v. Wade, something no Republican had been able to do since Roe v. Wade. Donald Trump faced down the media, the voracious pack of wolves in the media that tried to falsely accuse Brett Kavanaugh of sexual violence because they were so opposed to a constitutional scholar sitting on the bench of the Supreme Court. Donald Trump had the courage to appoint Amy Coney Barrett after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, even though the left told him he was breaking norms, by nominating a new justice during that particular period of time. Donald Trump was the most pro-life president of our time. And I don't agree either, by the way, with Donald Trump watering down the RNC platform on abortion. But I also understand that actions speak louder than words. Donald Trump's actions have been very pro-life. And the reason that they watered down the language, I'm not excusing it, I'm not justifying it, I'm just explaining why they did it. The reason they watered it down is because Republicans in general have failed so abysmally in fighting back against the left's lies when it comes to abortion. They categorize it as miscarriage care, as ectopic pregnancy care. They always tell these truly heartbreaking stories and act like the solution to those stories is abortion. And Republicans are too afraid of offending women to actually describe what an abortion is and to state unequivocal opposition to it. And so we've lost the culture war to a certain extent on abortion. And what Donald Trump is doing right now is trying to win this election. And I don't agree with the consultants that told him that the way to do that is not to offend women who are pro-abortion. That's not going to work, obviously. But that's the reason he did that. It's not because he had an ideological change of mind on abortion. And David French knows this. He writes, "In many ways, the most concretely conservative action I can take," this is French writing, "in this election is to vote for a candidate who will stand against Vladimir Putin. By voting for pro-life politicians down ballot, I can help prevent federal liberalization of abortion law. But if a president decides to abandon Ukraine and cripple NATO, there's little anyone can do." What? What? Is there actually anyone left who thinks that Zelensky is an honest character? The day Donald Trump takes office, he will put an end to the war in Ukraine. Do you think that Vladimir Putin would have invaded Ukraine if Donald Trump was president? The answer to that question is, of course not. Right now, what's happening is David French is on the side of the globalists who are devaluing the US dollar. In fact, there's a threat of the US dollar being rejected and abandoned as the world reserve currency because Biden is overspending, giving our money to Ukraine to the point that it's devalued the US dollar. If you support that, you are bananas. Bananas. French goes, "I loathe sex abuse, pornography, and adultery. Trump has brought these vices into the mainstream of the Republican Party." Trump did not bring sex abuse, pornography, and adultery into the Republican Party. What are you talking about? This was the sexual revolution, which was allowed by libertarians. Libertarians in the Republican Party allowed immorality to be ingrained in our country, immorality that came at the behest of the Marxists. And he goes, "America became more brutal and violent during Trump's term." And who was that was committing brutality and violence? Did you want to talk about the BLM riots? Did you want to talk about the Women's March? Did you want to talk about the anti-Semitic hordes on college campuses that are sympathetic to Hamas, who committed a brutal act of terror against innocent Israelis? Did you want to talk about the crime being committed by illegal aliens who have come across the border illegally thanks to Biden's open borders policy? Did you want to mention that this violence is being committed by leftists who think that people on the right deserve to be silenced and canceled and brutalized? Or did you just want to pretend that this is Trump's fault? Because a vote for Harris is a vote for all of those things. A vote for Harris is a vote for abortion. A vote for Harris is a vote for open borders. A vote for Harris is a vote to weaken the U.S. standing in the world by devaluing our currency, giving it to a crook in Ukraine. I don't know what David French's problem is. I don't know why he flipped. I don't know what happened to his mind. I don't know what happened to his politics. But there is absolutely no excuse on planet Earth for a conservative to vote for Kamala Harris. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for some headlines. Some headlines that the mainstream media would rather you not hear. So we're going to talk about them together. This is from the Pennsylvania Department of State. It's on X, and this is what they posted. Quote, Pennsylvanians won't always know the final results of all races on election night. Any changes in results that occur as counties continue to count ballots are not evidence that an election is, quote unquote, rigged. See the full explanation at vote.pa.gov/fact-check. Okay, first of all, a government is not supposed to serve as a fact check. A government is supposed to tell the truth, and journalists are supposed to serve as a fact check to hold accountable any government officials that are lying. If you as a government are fact checking something, you are acting as propaganda. Perhaps that's neither here nor there, except for the fact that this is propaganda. This is propaganda. Why would the Pennsylvania Department of State, this is the question that should be asked, why is the Pennsylvania Department of State warning us 3 months before the election that we're actually not going to know the results of the election on the night of the election? They already know this. They can see into the future. Sorry, we're going to have stuff go wrong. There's nothing we can do in 3 months ahead of time to prevent this. But don't worry, just because you can't see it and you don't know any information, if there's a wildly different result that happens from the time you go to bed until the time you wake up in the morning, nothing shady going on here. Let me tell you what they're going to do. Let me tell you why they're saying this. They are preparing this so that they have plausible deniability. We told you this would happen. This is not unusual. We warned you months ago that this would happen. And the reason that they're warning us is because they need to know on the night of the election how many votes they need to beat Donald Trump. What the actual tally of the election is, they need to know how many votes they need to find overnight so Joe Biden wins that critical swing state of Pennsylvania. That is why they are posting this. But the mainstream media doesn't want you to know about that. All right, there was a report this week that Joe Rogan, popular podcaster Joe Rogan, endorsed RFK Jr. for president. And when I saw this, I thought, oh man, that's too bad and kind of dumb. It turns out it's not true. It's fake news. Joe Rogan did not endorse RFK Jr. In fact, Joe Rogan himself denied that he endorsed RFK Jr. He said he likes the guy. He spoke very highly of the guy. He endorses some of his policies, but he did not endorse him in the sense that Joe Rogan did not say he was going to vote for RFK and that you should vote for RFK. That's what an endorsement is. And I'm glad he said this because it would be kind of stupid to endorse RFK. And I say that as someone who actually likes RFK Jr. I like his crusade against Big Pharma. I like his crusade against the deep state. But RFK Jr., the fact that he is still running for president is problematic, and here's why. This weekend, this is a little personal anecdote, this weekend I took my daughters to the farmer's market, and let me just say I was in full mom mode, like sunglasses, hair in a bun, babies crawling all over me. And there was a table, an RFK table at the farmer's market, and the guy that was behind the RFK table stops me and he goes, "Hello, ma'am, may I speak with you for a moment? Are you at all concerned about my children's future, or about your children's future?" And I kind of laughed because I realized he didn't recognize me, and I said, "Yes, sir, I am concerned about my children's future, just a little bit." And he says, "Well, then can we talk about RFK Jr.? Do you have any interest in voting for him?" And I said, I think RFK is great. I think he's great on Big Pharma. I think he's great on the deep state. I find him to be, pretty uncompromising in his principles, although I don't agree with his stance on abortion and climate change. But I don't think it's smart to vote for him because he can't win. And the guy goes, "Well, the only person that can make these changes is RFK." And I was like, well, sure, he knows a lot about Big Pharma, but I'm hoping he teams up with Trump and takes on Big Pharma. And the guy goes, "But we need RFK in the White House." And so then I was like, okay, this guy's not listening. So I said, well, here's how I view it. And this is what I told RFK at the RNC. If you're running as a third party in a system, a two-party system, even if you don't like the two-party system, then you are effectively a spoiler. If you are a spoiler for Joe Biden, please be my guest Please run. Please spoil for Joe Biden, or in this case, Kamala Harris. But if you are spoiling in any way for Donald Trump, then I can't support you, and it actually makes me think less of you. And I don't know at this point. There's valid arguments on both sides. Is he spoiling for Kamala Harris because there are disaffected Democrats who don't want someone as radical as Kamala or Joe Biden? Or is he spoiling for Donald Trump because there are a lot of suburban women, say, who like RFK Jr.'s stance on vaccines and don't like Trump's mean tweets? A couple of months ago, I argued that RFK was a spoiler for Joe Biden because there were so many people that think Joe Biden's too old. Now that it's Kamala Harris, I don't know. But what I do know is that RFK seems to be actively trying to recruit Republican voters to vote for him. And the reason that I say that is because every time I open my X feed, which is about 100 times a day, there are multiple ads from RFK targeting me. And I think it's pretty obvious on my X account that I am a Republican and that I am going to be voting for Trump. So RFK is trying to recruit from Trump voters, which means he's going to act as a spoiler to Trump, and I don't like that. Because if he spoils for Trump, who do we get in the White House? We get Kamala Harris in the White House. And that's bad news for everybody. So it's good news that Joe Rogan didn't endorse RFK, but I do question what RFK is doing right now if he's actively trying to spoil for Donald Trump. Speaking of Big Pharma, our next headline is best introduced with a video. This is Dr. Anthony Fauci. And I will let Dr. Anthony Fauci speak for himself. Take a look.
I got infected about 2 weeks ago. It was my third infection, and I had been vaccinated and boosted a total of 6 times.
I'm sorry you were sick, Dr. Fauci. Truly, I'm sorry. 3 times? Even I haven't had COVID 3 times, and I'm not vaccinated. 6 times? What kind of absolute nutcase gets the COVID vaccine 6 times? Oh, the kind that gets COVID 3 times because you've shot your immune system. That actually should be the public health announcement that the Trump campaign runs after they win the White House. Don't get the COVID booster or else this will happen. You'll get COVID 3 times. So our next headline, Kamala Harris copied Donald Trump on his new plan for no tax on tips. And this is particularly interesting because this was Donald Trump's effort, and a good effort, Donald Trump's effort to appeal to white working class. Waitresses, for example, they work on tips. They get paid minimum wage and work on tips. And then they're supposed to self-report the tax that they're supposed to pay on the tips. It's a terrible system. And Trump says he's going to do away with that. There's going to be no tax on tips. This is a great policy. And Kamala Harris comes out and says, actually, I'm also going to implement a policy that there's no tax on tips. She's trying to take the wind out of Trump's sails. And it is critically important that we recognize the following. This is a headline from the IRS itself, and I quote, IRS introduces new service industry tip reporting program. This is, in other words, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris actually hired more IRS agents in order to make sure that those waitresses paid taxes on the tips, or else the IRS was going to come after them. That's what Harris actually did, and now she's verbally claiming she wants to do away with taxes on tips. What an absolute liar. An absolute liar. It is, I will grant her, a strategic move to try to take the wind out of Trump's sails, and I don't think it will work, except that the mainstream media are such propagandists, but hey, that's why we're here. All right, so the mainstream media absolutely freaked out, and I mean freaked out over the nickname that we gave to Tim Walz, Tampon Tim. I'm just immature enough, guys. This name cracks me up. Tampon Tim. Haha. Every time I say it, every time I read it. The mainstream media freaked out because I think they recognize that it is a very effective nickname. I said earlier this week, I think it is, if not the most effective political nickname of all time, it is just one step below Crooked Hillary in that ranking because it tells you everything you need to know about Tim Walz. He put tampons in boys' bathrooms. Ew. What a creep. He is denying objective reality in the name of gender ideology. He wants you to think that girls who identify as boys are actually boys. No, they have periods, which is why they need that tampon in the first place. So we labeled Tim Walz Tampon Tim, and the media freaks out. I want to read a couple of these articles because the media understands that this is a liability for Tim Walz. Otherwise, they wouldn't be lying in the following manner. This is from The Independent. Last year, Minnesota Governor Walz signed a bill into law mandating that free sanitary products must be available to all menstruating students in restrooms used by students in grades 4 to 12 across Minnesota schools. Coming into effect on the 1st of January, the bill ensures that young girls, non-binary, and trans students all have access to the simple but essential products. Since Walz was unveiled as Kamala Harris's chosen running mate on Tuesday, Republicans have jumped to criticize him over the bill. Oh, did we jump? Did we jump? Appearing to miss the fact that the bill is for school children, conservative political commentator Liz Wheeler took to X to post an image of a box of tampons with Walz's face photoshopped onto it. He put tampons in men's bathrooms. What a creep, she falsely claimed. Let's stop right there. Do you appreciate my dramatization? This is how I picture these leftists writing these articles. She falsely claimed they're being mean to Tim Walz. How do we get back against them? This is what the law says. For everyone's information. Quote, must be available. This is sanitary products. Must be available to all menstruating students in restrooms regularly used by students in grades 4 to 12 according to a plan developed by the school district. That is verbiage from the law itself. Walk into a public school boys' bathroom. Look on the wall. What you will find are tampons. Go do it. Don't deny that it's true until you've walked in there and seen it with your own eyes. Because Tim Walz buys into gender ideology. They're denying, so first of all, they're denying it's true. That's a lie. The second argument that they're using, this is from Minnesota Public Radio. They say some Minnesota Republicans initially tried to limit the initiative to female-assigned and gender-neutral bathrooms, but were unsuccessful. Even the author of that amendment ultimately voted for the final version of the bill, saying his family members, quote, felt that it was an important issue that I should support. Ew. So you caved because people, leftist members of your family, pressured you? Ew. But I digress. The bill's inclusive language reflects that not all people who menstruate are women, and not all women get periods, which was important to those who lobbied for the legislation. Again, this is just confirming that Tim Walz supports gender ideology. The LA Times wrote a very snarky article about me after that episode that we did on Tampon Tim and how effective a nickname it is. They wrote, women menstruate. Girls do too, even girls who go to school. Sometimes these girls forget to take tampons or pads and find themselves in the embarrassing and uncomfortable situation of bleeding through clothing. Let's just pause there for a second. You'll notice what the left is doing is they are trying to act as if Tim Walz putting tampons in boys' bathrooms was for any other reason except the reality that Tim Walz supports gender ideology, that Tim Walz believes that boys can be girls if they identify as girls and girls can be boys if they trans. They can't just admit that that's why Tim Walz did this. They have to have any other excuse. So they're like, sometimes girls have to rush into a boys' bathroom because it's an emergency. That's not why Tim Walz put tampons in boys' bathrooms. Let's not pretend that it is. LA Times goes, in recent years, the absurdity of not making it easy to get basic sanitary products to half the country has dawned on legislatures across America. Even conservative Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed a bill making the Lone Star State the 25th in the nation to eliminate the so-called pink tax, or a sales tax on period products. This is also not about the pink tax. It has nothing to do with the pink tax whatsoever. And again, any other reason that leftists can try to make you believe was the reason Tim Walz put tampons in boys' bathrooms, because they know that this is a liability. They know that parents don't like this. They know that even the demographics of people that they count on as voters, Black people, for example, Hispanic people, for example, they take the vote of those demographics for granted. But Black people and Hispanic people, in a generalized sense, do not support gender ideology. And so Democrats and their lackeys in the mainstream media do not want those people to know that Tim Walz put tampons in boys' bathrooms. I don't know if you guys watched the Spaces, the X Spaces that Elon Musk hosted yesterday. He interviewed President Donald Trump, but Donald Trump was this close to calling him Tampon Tim. He was like, Tim Walz put tampons in boys' bathroom. And I was like, yes, 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 say it, say Tampon Tim. And it was so close. It was so close. I give him a passing grade on that. I thought he did a great job. And I thought it was close enough to calling him Tampon Tim that he got the point across that Tim Walz put tampons in boys' bathrooms. I will be saying this 1,000 times before Election Day because it is one of the most effective ways of illuminating the reality of Tim Walz to the voters. Raw Story goes on to say, oh wait, We're not finished with the LA Times. I forgot this part. This is my favorite part. The LA Times writes, the amount of transgender apoplexy coming from the far right is astounding and troubling. And that insanity is where Tampon Tim originates, an attempt to make Walz seem both predatory and dangerous to kids, when in fact he's the opposite. Tampon Tim, it is hands down the best political nickname ever. It's so savagely effective, wrote political commentator Liz Wheeler on social media. She's the author of Hide Your Children, Exposing the Marxists Behind the Attack on America's Kids. Well, thanks for the shout out, LA Times, the one good part of your article. In one word, it tells you everything you need to know about Tim Walz's dangerous radicalism, Wheeler continued. Never mind that Tampon Tim is 2 words. Math is hard, writes the LA Times. Well, actually, LA Times, the one word that I was referencing was tampon. Tim, the name, actually doesn't tell you anything about his ideology. But the one word, tampon, does. But I know, reading comprehension can be challenging. He put tampons in men's bathrooms. He'll trans kids. He took away parental rights, they say, quoting me. He's woke and creepy. The LA Times then writes, he'll trans kids. What does that even mean? Well, let me tell you what that means. It means he supports queer theory being taught to school children in school. He made Minnesota a quote-unquote transgender sanctuary state, which means that children under the age of 18, whose parents do not support giving them puberty-blocking medication, cross-sex hormone therapy, or allowing them to undergo genital mutilation surgery in the name of transgender ideology, those children are allowed in Minnesota to gain access to that devastating and irreversible medical mutilation without their parents' consent, thanks to Tim Walz. Tim Walz will trans your kid. And he signed legislation that proves it. That's the root of this nickname, Tampon Tim. It's not just vulgar and salacious and hilarious and funny. It's not just weird and creepy and woke to put tampons in boys' bathrooms. Tim Walz is dangerous. Tim Walz will trans your kids. And the vast, vast majority of the American people are viscerally and morally against that. And the left knows it, which is why they are freaking out. The LA Times concludes by saying Tampon Tim is not the burn you think it is. It's not intended to be a burn. It's intended to be revelatory. And it is. Guys, make sure you leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Go over, search The Liz Wheeler Show, scroll down to the bottom, hit 5 stars. Tell me why you like the show. Tell me who you want the next guest to be, or the next guests next week on the episodes. Go to youtube.com/Liz Wheeler. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. Also hit that bell so that you get a notification on your phone or on your computer whenever we publish a new episode or drop a new video. YouTube doesn't always put my videos in your feed, even if you subscribe. So you gotta get those notifications so that you know what we're talking about, because this stuff is the stuff that matters. And it's my honor and it's my privilege to talk to you about this stuff each and every day. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.